Edwin Diaz looked electric in his return to an MLB mound on Monday. Is he back to being the best closer in baseball? I'll break it all down on today's show.
You are Locked On Mets, your daily New York Mets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello to all you amazing Mets fans. You're watching Locked On Mets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Ryan Finkelstein. If you want to find any of my work, follow me on X at Finkelstein Ryan. You can also find some of my writing at justbaseball.com, where I work as the managing editor. Today's episode is brought to you by PrizePicks, the easiest and most exciting way to play daily fantasy sports. Go to prizepicks.com/LockedOnMLB and use the code, all in lowercase, LockedOnMLB for a first deposit match up to $100. Edwin Diaz was back for the Mets on Monday and looked amazing. Before we talk about that, we got to give Tyler McGill another shout out for a strong outing in spring. 4 innings pitched, allowed 3 hits. One of them was a solo homer to Tim Anderson. But again, he did not walk a batter, which is the really promising sign with McGill this spring. Just has not been giving up those free passes. Had 2 strikeouts, got up to 61 pitches. His ERA on the spring right now is at 1.50. Definitely looks like he has earned himself a spot in that starting rotation. Also, another quick note, Francisco Alvarez gunned down John Birdie in this game. Birdie is one of the fastest runners, best base stealers in baseball. And Alvarez just delivered a perfect throw, showed that improved pop time. I talked about Alvarez and what he's done to really improve himself and control the running game this year on a show last week. So you can check that out for a little more information if you hadn't watched or listened to that show on how much Alvarez has improved and why that improvement to controlling the running game really bodes well for what I believe is going to be a breakout season. But with all of that said, the story of the game was Edwin Diaz. In the 5th inning, the trumpets blared at Clover Park. A little bit anticlimactic if you are going back to the loss of Edwin Diaz and how those trumpets used to blare in 2022 and all of the hype around it, to then seeing a crowd on a Florida night with the sun still out with daylight savings. Half of them standing, half of them still sitting, applauding Diaz coming out. Wasn't as electric as the return's going to be when he gets on a Citi Field mound. The Mets have a lead on opening day and the entire crowd is going ballistic, but still good to hear the trumpets blare, to see Diaz come out. And man, it looked like Edwin Diaz of old. First batter he faces Jesus Sanchez. He throws 98 miles per hour that Sanchez was able to foul off for the first pitch. Then he was nowhere near the zone. Missed with a couple sliders. Sanchez gets himself into a hitter's count at 2-1. So now he's just going to swing. And Diaz throws a slider in on him, swings right through it, throws a fastball up and away that's nowhere close. Sanchez was able to lay off of it, gets to a full count. Once again, just buries the sinker in on him that, was in, Sanchez's batter's box, and he swung right through it. That was the first strikeout. Then Avisail Garcia steps in the box, and that is just barbecue chicken for Edwin Diaz. That's like putting, Tony Parker in the post against Shaquille O'Neal. That's just one example of what that looks like. It might even be worse than that. It might be putting a kindergartner in the post against Shaquille O'Neal. I don't know how to describe it, but Avisail Garcia is not a good hitter. And he's a righty, and he stands 0 chance. Edwin Diaz could throw him 100 fastballs in a row or 100 sliders in a row, and I don't even know if the guy would put bat on ball. I really don't. And in this at-bat, he certainly didn't. He swung through 3 pitches, 2 of them sliders, 1 of them a fastball, stood no chance. Then John Birdie steps in. He strikes out swing on a couple of sliders at the end of the at-bat. Just disgusting stuff from Edwin Diaz. He threw 14 pitches. 9 of them were strikes. 1 of them was a called strike. 1 of them was the first swing that got any contact where Jesus Sanchez fouled a ball off. And other than that, the Marlins came nowhere near the baseball. 7 whiffs. Just dominant stuff from Edwin Diaz. He looks back. And if he is pitching at his apex, like we saw in 2022, he's the best relief pitcher in all of baseball and the most valuable relief pitcher in all of baseball. We're at right at justbaseball.com. We are doing our top 10s. We've actually completed our top 10s at each position, and we did top 10 relievers in the game. And the way we came up with our rankings this year, we had a panel of 6 of our writers, or just the people that work for us that do our podcast and everything else. But 6 of us all made our own top 10 lists at each position. And then we created an aggregate score that allowed us to have sort of a set of rankings that had less debate, where we just all sort of argued, and it was more scientific in a way to be able to kind of keep that argument out of it and just do it based on here's what all of us came up with, and here was our combined results. And despite the fact that Edwin Diaz has not pitched in a year, we all had Edwin Diaz number 1. Or, excuse me, 4 of the 6 of us had Edwin Diaz number 1. One of us had number 2. Our guy Colby Olson, who kind of threw off a lot of our rankings, had him number 4. But regardless, the point being, when it came to the aggregate scores, Diaz was far and away considered the best reliever in all of baseball. And you look at the projection models, and they back up what we have on the site here, because Zips, has all of their projections for the season. And you look at ERA for relief pitchers, the top 2 relievers based on Zips projections are Edwin Diaz and Felix Bautista. Now, Bautista is out with the Tommy John surgery, so you really can kind of remove him. Edwin Diaz would now be the only reliever who has a projected ERA in the 2.6s at 2.62. Beyond that, you have Joan Duran, Emmanuel Clase, and Andres Munoz, who are the only other relievers with projected ERAs in the 2.8s that are below 3. Everybody else is 3 or higher. You go to fielding independent pitching, which is projected as well by Zips. This removes defense from the equation, right? This is just how good the pitcher is. His projected fielding independent pitching is 2.29. That's what's projected to be. The next closest is Pete Fairbanks at 2.78. So when you look at just the cold hard facts of the pitching, Edwin Diaz is by far projected to be the best relief pitcher in all of baseball. His WAR projection of 1.4 is the best as well. And if you go back to 2022, he put up an F4 of 3 as a reliever, which is damn near impossible to do. So what Edwin Diaz did in the past was remarkable. The loss of Edwin Diaz last year is a huge reason why the New York Mets faltered the way they did. I want to talk about that a little bit more in the next segment, how he will be the most valuable pitcher the Mets have this year, and how his presence can actually take this team that is right now sort of projected to be a 500 ball club, and Edwin Diaz alone could lift them to be better than that and actually be a wild card team. So we'll go through the impact that Diaz will have this year in just a minute. First, though, today's episode is brought to you by PrizePicks. Testing your skills on PrizePicks this season is the most exciting way to play daily fantasy sports, because if you have the skills, you can turn $10 into $1,000 with just a few taps, because it's daily fantasy sports made easy, where you pick more or less on 2 to 6 player stat projections, and you can watch the winnings roll in. Right now, you can look at MLB season stats projections, right? So you can find MLB season. There's a tab that's spelled out MLB season SZN, and you can find all your stats for the year, like RBIs. So if you want to take more on Pete Alonso's RBIs at 108.5, maybe you'll take more on Matt Olson's at 109.5. And let's just say you're looking at Mike Trout's 94.5. You think the Angels aren't going to be very good. Maybe you don't trust that Mike Trout's going to be healthy. You take less than on that. You combine the 3. You can win big. Download the app today and use the code all in lowercase LOCKEDONMLB for a first deposit match up to $100. Again, that is the app of PrizePicks. Use the code LOCKEDONMLB for a first deposit match up to $100. Pick more, pick less. It's that easy. Head to PrizePicks today. Earlier this offseason, I did a podcast where I ranked the top 10 most valuable players on the New York Mets for the upcoming season. And I had Edwin Diaz right behind Kodai Senga. And that was the decision that I really battled with in my mind when I was preparing for the show. There was a big part of me that thought, man, Edwin Diaz, the impact that he had in 2022, the loss that he was to the team in 2023, I wanted to put him ahead of Kodai Senga. But I kept coming back to innings pitched. And if Senga was going to deliver 170 to 180 innings, it just felt like a knock to him to not say he's the most valuable pitcher. And also the fact that he just stood out so much as the only frontline guy the Mets had. Now that Senga's out, though, for the first month of the season, I think you really have to flip that. And Edwin Diaz is the most valuable pitcher on the New York Mets. And there's not even a close second in some respects because the loss of Senga is going to be felt. And Edwin Diaz is the guy that you look at. He's the only special pitcher on this entire team. Like, I think the Mets have good depth. I believe they have enough good quality arms to make it through and to get decent enough starts where they're hanging in games. And if the lineup can score runs and the other relievers can hold it down and just get that ball to Edwin, that's where the Mets are going to make their money this year. And that's where they didn't last season. So his impact, especially just the mental edge he gives your team, that is going to be so massive for this club. And it starts right away. Whereas Kodai Senga, he's going to be able to lift this rotation, but it's going to take some time to get there. When you look at the loss of Diaz last season, it is felt when you look at the record in one-run games. In 2022, the Mets were 21-15 in one-run games. There were 6 games over 500. And they had a lot of blowouts, so there wasn't as many one-run games because of how good the lineup was. But still, last year, they had more one-run games, and they were 25-28. So there were 3 games under 500. You'd be surprised. You would have thought it might have been worse than that. But hey, maybe the relievers at times blew a lead so bad that they lost by 2. Regardless, to go from 6 games over to 3 games under, that's a pretty big impact. And then you look at save opportunities and saves converted for all these different guys they had. David Robertson was good. 14 for 17 in save opportunities. Adam Ottavino, when he assumed that role from Robertson, also in some respects was pretty good. He was 12 for 15. Then again, he also lost 7 games for the Mets last year. His record was 1-7. Drew Smith lost 6 games. And you go down the line when it comes to save opportunities. I didn't mark every single guy, although I think Trevor Gott was 1 for 5 and Drew Smith was 3 for 6. But regardless, you combine all the other relievers outside of Robertson and Ottavino, and the rest of them went 8 for 20 in save opportunities. So that's 12 blown saves right there. David Robertson, Adam Ottavino, they went 26 of 32, which isn't bad, but still, that's 6 blown saves. So altogether, the New York Mets blew 18 saves last year. They won 75 games. If you convert half of those, the Mets are an 84-win team. The Marlins made the playoffs with 84 wins. The Diamondbacks made the playoffs with 84 wins. And the Mets had a better head-to-head record against both of those teams. So if it ended up being a tiebreaker between those 3 at the end of the year, guess who would have made the playoffs? The New York Mets. There's your impact from the loss of Edwin Diaz right there. And I know it's not entirely that cut and dry. Some of these guys still would have gotten save opportunities if Edwin was on the team, and Edwin did blow some saves in 2022. But his absence was so massive. And now you look ahead, having him back in the mix is so big for this team. They got to find a way to get to 4 or 5 relievers that Carlos Mendoza can trust. And there is some questions about that. I'm going to compare them to the Phillies and the Braves and the Marlins in the next segment here, who has the best bullpen in this division. And those others really do drag the Mets down. But what I will say is pitching that 8th inning for Edwin Diaz as the closer compared to for David Robertson as the closer, for some reason, I just feel like other guys in that bullpen are going to be more relaxed. If they have a 3-run lead, right? If they know they got Edwin that can bail them out. And really, it goes on the other side too, opposing teams. if they know that there's no Edwin Diaz lurking, they might be just a little bit more relaxed in the 7th and 8th innings. Now you're losing by 1. It's the 7th inning, and Edwin Diaz is in that back end, and anytime you get a rally going, the Mets could deploy him. All of a sudden, everyone's gripping that bat a little bit tighter. And the same thing on the other side. The Mets have a 2-run lead in the 8th inning. And they know that, especially at the end of the year, it could have been Trevor Gott coming out for the 9th. All of a sudden, those guys are really tense, trying to add on as many runs as they can to protect their, bad bullpen. But when Edwin Diaz is back there, I feel like the game's already won. Just go out there and hit. I think there is just such a mental edge that Diaz gives this team. There's something about those trumpets blaring in Citi Field that just makes the other team feel like, all right, it's over, and makes the Mets confident that we got this one in the bag. So having him back, to see him get on a mound and touch 98 in a spring training outing where he's, I'm sure, amped up a little bit, but not to the extent that he's going to be pitching in front of 40,000 in Citi Field. To see him be able to just casually get 98, to see that nasty bite on his slider that guys just stand no chance against. It's a huge, huge, huge addition that this team has just made, and it's just getting a guy healthy. You can talk about Starling Marte being back, fully healthy. Jeff McNeil maybe having a bounce back year. You can discuss Brett Beatty and Mark Vientos being better than they were last season, or Francisco Alvarez breaking out. All these different things that can move the needle. Or even just the additions the Mets made this offseason. Harrison Bader's outfield defense, or Severino, Hauser in the rotation, whatever it is. If you look at year-to-year impact, having Diaz in 22, not having him in 2023, and having him back in 2024, no one really moves the needle more. And I did a whole show about Edwin Diaz moving the needle literally a month ago to this day. I was just looking back. It was February 12th, where I discussed a lot of this. But here I am reiterating it because he's back on a big league mound. Edwin Diaz, when you watch him pitch, there's such a, I don't know the exact word to describe it. There's so little doubt that he leaves about how good he is. And he obviously had the mental hiccups his first season. That was also the year of the juice ball, and the seams, I think, affected his slide. There's a lot of things you can look at in that first season, but what he's been to the Mets the last 3 years, what he was to them the last time we saw him on a big league mound, and the fact that he looked identical to that now that we're seeing him out there again. Yeah, this guy can really make the Mets a playoff team. That's how much of an impact he can have. If everyone else on the roster gets the Mets to 80 wins, let's say, and Edwin Diaz is 1.31 ERA again, that good, could that be worth 6 wins in the standings by the end of the season? I really do think it can be, and that's all you need to make the playoffs now. So having him back, it's awesome to see. Now, does Edwin Diaz's return give the Mets the best bullpen in the NL East? I'll look at that in the final segment. Before we get to that, though, today's episode is brought to you by Amazon Fire TV. Fire TV offers amazing viewing experiences with smart TVs, as well as the Fire TV stick that you can plug into your existing TV. It provides access to millions of movies and TV episodes, as well as free and live TV. I love the Fire Stick because I got it in my living room. I can watch all my different streaming services, and then I can take them all on the road with me. When I'm in a hotel, plug that same Fire Stick into that TV, and you get all the same stuff you're seeing at home. And Fire TV also recently created the Fire TV channels, deliver a constant supply of the latest videos from your favorite sports brands, all for free. That includes all of us at Locked On and most of the big pro leagues and college conferences as well. Fire TV channels let you dive into all the game analysis, highlights, and more to keep up to date with all the latest in the world of sports. If you haven't checked out Fire TV channels, you should. To learn more, visit www.amazon.com/LockedOnFireTV. So who has the best bullpen in the National League East? The way I try to figure it out is I went to Roster Resource on FanGraphs, which gives you a projected starting lineup, bench, starting rotation, bullpen for each team. It really does give you a comprehensive view of all 30 teams in baseball, and it has projections for the upcoming season. So you look at the FanGraphs depth chart projections, and you look at the bullpens. For the Braves, when it comes to ERAs under 4, they have Raisel Iglesias at 3.35, AJ Minter at 3.55, Joe Jimenez and Pierce Johnson at 3.79, Aaron Bummer at 3.66, and Dylan Lee at 3.71. You count them up, that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 guys with a projected ERA under 4. Look at the New York Mets, they got Edwin Diaz, that's it. Look at the Phillies. They have Jose Alvarado, Matt Strahm, and Orion Kerkering. Alvarado 3.31, Strahm 3.74, Kerkering 3.82. Marlins, you got Tanner Scott, Andrew Nardi, and Sixto Sanchez. Scott 3.21, Nardi 3.82. Sixto at 3.99, which is really strange because how do you project a guy that has sort of vanished for a couple of years? I guess it's based on what he looked like as a starting pitcher and now trying to project him out as a reliever. I don't get that one. And then you got the Mets, like I said, only Diaz under 4, and that's at a 2.70 projected ERA. Adam Ottavino's at 4.11, Brooks Raley at 4.15, Jake Diekman at 4.25. With all that said, to me, the difference between Edwin Diaz and Tanner Scott, between Edwin Diaz and Jose Alvarado, I believe the Mets have the second best bullpen in this division. The Braves just have too many arms. Raisel Iglesias is a good closer. Edwin is, in my eyes, still significantly better, but the setup men for the Braves are just so much better than what the Mets got. But do they have a pathway to a really good bullpen? I do believe that they can get there. Adam Ottavino can have a nice season. I think one of Raley or Diekman's going to be really good. And hey, maybe both of them will be good. Nate Lavender, for some reason, is a guy that I just look at the way he's striking at batters. And I think by the end of the year, is Nate Lavender pitching the 8th inning for the New York Mets? It sounds crazy right now in the middle of March, but 6 months from now, who knows? So I like what they have there. You also, of course, have the Fujinami wild card. He could be the 8th inning guy. Maybe you want to space out the velocity and have him pitch the 7th inning. But there were times last year when he was pitching for the Orioles that he looked lights out. He's got to figure out the walks. He's got to be able to attack the zone. But he's got incredible stuff. He's a huge guy. He's 6'6". Fujinami really could move the needle. Jorge Lopez is another guy that has a lot of volatility, coming off a bad year, could be great again. I am less convinced about Jorge Lopez, particularly because the numbers in spring haven't been great, and that's coming off a bad season. And he didn't have the longest run of success. He had a great 2022 season, but it's not like he had 3 great years pitching out of bullpen. So I don't know if Jorge Lopez will always just be remembered as a flash in the pan all-star for the Orioles in 2022, or if he can get back to that. I think it was a good upside play by the Mets, but still, I'm not counting on him being the guy. But there's so many options the Mets have because David Stearns is really good at building bullpens that you look at how many different pitchers could end up being trusted. And I think the Mets are going to find 4 guys outside of just Edwin Diaz that Carlos Mendoza can count on throughout the year. I think there's going to be a group that ends up solidifying themselves in that circle of trust, and they're going to be able to bridge the gap to Edwin, and then Edwin Diaz is going to be able to shut the door. If you look at 2022 when the Mets won 101 games, how many good relievers did they really have? They had Diaz, they had Adam Ottavino. The two of them were spectacular. Drew Smith and Seth Lugo were both really solid ERAs in the mid-3s. And then you got like surprising performances from Tommy Hunter and Steven Nogasek, who both had ERAs in the 2.4s, and they combined to pitch nearly 45 innings. And Trevor Williams with the sub-3 ERA, too, if I'm not mistaken, coming out of the pen. So, they had some really good fortune in that bullpen. But really, when you talk about guys that were trusted, it was Diaz, Ottavino, Smith, and Lugo. So you don't need 6 guys that you can trust. You just have to get to a solid 4, really. And with that, the Mets bullpen in 2022 ranked 10th in baseball in wins above replacement and in ERA. And last year, they ranked 22nd in ERA and 29th in wins above replacement. So there is a huge, huge margin that they can improve just based on how bad they were in that department. And when you really look at the different units on the New York Mets, look at the outfield, the infield, the rotation, the bullpen. Because of Edwin Diaz's presence, I think that might be the group that come season's end is the most valuable in a sense. It is the group that ranks the highest among the league, where the Mets have a top 5 bullpen in the game or a top 10 bullpen. And I don't know if their outfield's going to be top 10 or their infield's going to be top 10. I certainly don't think their rotation is going to be top 10, despite how good it looks in spring. So the bullpen is really a huge, huge, huge X factor for this team. And Edwin Diaz is the real reason why they can be special as a unit. So awesome to see him back on the mound. Be looking forward to watching him pitch again throughout this spring. He's not going to do back-to-backs anytime soon, so you're not going to see him today as you're listening to this, but you'll see him again. And by the end of spring, he'll probably have at least one back-to-back outing to make sure he is just ready to go for the season. And it should be completely 100% full bore Edwin Diaz by March 28th. And that's going to be an awesome sight when he eventually gets back on a Citi Field mound. Anyway, that's going to be all for today's edition of Locked On Mets. I appreciate all of you for tuning in. If you're listening on the audio side, make sure you follow, rate, and review wherever you get your podcast. If you're watching on YouTube, hit that subscribe button. Our next big goal is to get to 10,000 subs. So I appreciate all of you who subscribe. You can follow me on X at Finkelstein Ryan. Follow the show at Locked On Mets. Thank you for making Locked On Mets your first listen or your first watch every day. Now, for your second watch, head over to YouTube to the first ever 24/7 streaming channel covering everything in the world of sports. Of course, I'm talking about Locked On Sports Today with our local experts that cover each team and our league-wide experts that cover each league. You find Locked On Sports Today streaming 24/7 on YouTube.